just going to plow ahead. All right, so we're going to start talking about the nervous system. And we're going to start with the neuron, which is the signaling cell in the nervous system. And I'm going to draw kind of an idealized and this cell, of course, they're going to be different in other places in the body, but this is kind of one of the most popular, we call, idealized neurons, and we call this a multipolar neuron. So let's start at this end. And this thing, this part, this big round part, is called the cell body. And the cell body has the nucleus in it. That's a nucleus, you can tell. And then it's got these extensions all over it. They kind of branch out like that. And these are called dendrites. And these dendrites are going to receive signals from other cells. And they get their name because they're kind of branched like trees. And dendro, that part, means tree. So that's where that name comes from. Now on the dendrites, which you won't normally see drawn because there are so many of them and they're really small. They're these little tiny things that they're little projections, and we call those dendritic spines. And they're actually going to be all over the place, those little things, okay? And those are actually going to connect to other cells. And your brain, or your nervous system, not necessarily your brain, can actually create more dendritic spines very quickly. And so that's one of the ways that we learn things, is actually creating new dendritic spines. Now, coming off of the cell body, we have this part right here that's kind of funnel shaped, and that is called the axon hillock. And then it narrows to an area that we call the axon. And axons can be very, very long. In some of the cells in your body, the axon can actually travel all the way from your spinal cord to muscles. So imagine the muscles in your foot. You could have one cell that goes from the spinal cord all the way to your foot. All right, so then at the end, where it gets close to whatever the target cell is, whatever it's going to be talking to, the axon branches into what we call axon terminals, and they are also called telodendria, although most people call them axon terminals. Those are these branches. Actually, can I undo that? Yeah, let's undo that. Okay, so the telodendria are these branches here. And then at the end of each branch, there's a little swollen part, kind of a little nubbin. And those are called synaptic bulbs, or bulb, or bouton, which is the French for button, and that is where it connects to another cell. So that's actually going to be the point of connection. And in places where neurons talk to each other, these synaptic bulbs are going to connect to, hey, dendritic spines over here. Okay? So that's your basic neuron. Okay, those are your basic parts of the neuron. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring up another page, and I'm going to just zoom in on part of the axon so that we can talk about how axons signal. I might as well go ahead and save this because it's quite lovely. I think we can all agree. We'll just name that neuron. I don't know where I put it. Good luck finding it later. All right, so now let's draw. Oh, that's too high. Let's draw it here. Okay, so now we're going to take part of the axon. So this is all a section of axon. And remember that long time ago, we learned about the sodium-potassium pump. And the sodium-potassium pump, was, its job was to send sodium ions out of the cell so that we end up with lots of sodium out here. Oops, A plus, Na plus. The occasional sodium in here, but not very much. And then what goes in through the sodium-potassium pump, that goes inside, are potassium. So we end up with lots and lots of potassium inside the cell and very little outside the cell. All right, so that's our sodium-potassium pump there. So we'll call that sodium-potassium pump. Right there. Okay, so it's standing there all the time doing its job, and as it does that, it's going to create a situation where there is a greater positive charge outside the cell than inside the cell. So I'm going to draw some more sodium so that we have that greater positive charge outside. So you remember there's 3 sodiums leaving the cell and 2 potassiums entering the cell for each cycle of the sodium-potassium pump. Because of that, the sodium-potassium pump makes the inside of the cell have a lower charge than the outside of the cell out here. And if we measure that, we can measure that, and it turns out that the inside of the cell is about negative 70 millivolts. So that's its normal. Negative, okay, let's try this again. Wow, not writing very well, am I? Negative 70 millivolts, lower than the outside of the cell. The outside of the cell is about 0 millivolts. So we call this level right here, whoops, that's a straight line. We call that the resting membrane potential. And that just means that because of the action of the sodium-potassium pump, the inside of the cell always has a more negative charge than the outside of the cell. Okay, now imagine that we also have some other channels along here, some other things. And it turns out that all along here, you know what, let me get a different brush for these. Let's try this. All along here, ooh, that's kind of fun, isn't it? We're going to have other channels. We have some on this side too. Okay, and they're sodium channels, and these sodium channels are going to open when the voltage changes from this basic 70 millivolts. Okay, so that's our resting membrane. So sometimes some of these sodium channels open, and when that happens, sodium starts rushing into the cell. As sodium starts rushing into the cell loses its membrane potential, and the charge starts increasing. And so these sodium channels here are actually going to respond to this change in membrane potential, membrane charge, as time progresses, going that way. And as the charge in the cell opens, that opens a new channel all the way along, and they open in a chain, one after another, so that the increase in the charge inside the cell, it travels along. So first this part increases, and then this part, and then this part, and then this part, and then this part as we go along. These channels, they're going to stay open for a while, and then they're going to shut again. Okay, so sodium's going to rush in, and then it's going to stop rushing in. And when those channels shut, the other thing that's going to happen is that potassium channels are going to open, and potassium is going to start going out of the cell. And we have these along both sides as well. Okay, all over, all the way down. So we start off with the sodium channels opening down here. The charge inside the cell increases, and then the sodium channels close, the potassium channels open, and the charge comes back down. They actually take a little longer to close than you would expect, so that our charge actually kind of overshoots, and then it comes back to the resting membrane potential. Okay, and that whole process there is called an action potential. And an action potential is a signal in a neuron. Or how about neuron? There we go. So that's how that happens, and all of that is happening inside that neuron cell. So this is how the action potential is going to move its way down the neuron. All right, so now that we've got that, let's go back to our PowerPoint here, and let's talk about the parts of the neuron, the parts of the nervous system, and see, what else we can learn about this. All right, so the neuron, we already did that. That's a single cell. And when you put a bunch of neurons together, you get a nerve. A nerve is a bunch of neurons together. And the neuron is going to carry signals, a lot of signals. Some neurons carry signals in one direction, some neurons carry signals in the other direction. Some nerves, excuse me. So each neuron carries signals in one direction. It is going to go from the dendrites into the cell body, down the axon, out the axon terminals, and out the synapse. So always traveling in one direction. Now, in a nerve, because we have a bunch of neurons together, some nerves carry signals in one direction, some carry signals in both directions. But in order to do that, you need two neurons. You need one going one way and one going the other way. Now, the nervous system as a whole is divided into the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of all the nerves that extend out from the brain and the spinal cord. So just this part, the spinal cord, and just this part, the brain, that's the central nervous system. And then everything else that extends out from that, all of this other stuff, that is all the peripheral nervous system. When nerves exit from the brain, we call them cranial nerves. And when nerves exit from the spinal cord, we call them spinal nerves. And then we also have these things called ganglia. And ganglia are clusters of cell bodies that are outside the central nervous system. So you can see these little lumps right here. This is a series of ganglia next to the spinal cord. And we're actually going to have neurons that bring sensory information to the spinal cord. The ganglia for these neurons is right here, and then the signal continues to travel into the spinal cord. Now, functionally, the nervous system is divided into a sensory nervous system and a motor nervous system. Sensory receives information from the body and sends that information to the brain, and we call that afferent signaling. Now, afferent, you can think of it as meaning arrive, and we're arriving at the central nervous system. Okay, so think of it as arriving at like the central depot, the main control center. The motor nervous system is going to send signals from the central nervous system to parts of the body. You know, we talked about motor neurons when we were talking about muscles, and we talked about how motor neurons are the neurons that carry signals to the muscles. But the motor nervous system also carries signals to glands, to organs, to the skin. So any signal going from the central nervous system out is a motor signal. Okay, and these are efferent signal. So the way I remember this is using this mnemonic same, and for same we have, whoops, sorry about that. What happened there? Ah, delete that, okay. For same, it's sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. Okay, and another way to remember it is sensory arrives, motor exits. Okay, so if you remember afferent means arrive, efferent means exit, then that will help you remember that. The sensory motor nervous system is divided into two divisions. The somatic sensory system is the one that you think of when you think of your senses. It receives information from your skin, from your joints, from your muscles. That's all what we think of as touch. We'll talk about this more later. Touch is actually much more complicated than we think of it, but essentially we kind of lump all those together as touch. Somatic sensory neurons also bring signals from the eyes and vision, from the ears, that's sound, from the nose, smell, and also from the taste buds, taste. The visceral sensory division brings information from the internal organs and the glands to the brain. And most of that happens below the level of sensory knowledge or below the level of consciousness. Any change in a neuron's environment is called a stimulus. Stimuli, of course, is plural. So anything that makes a neuron in either division send a signal, that's a stimulus. Okay? So right now you're listening to this, you're watching the mouse move around. These are all stimuli that are being carried by your eyes and ears to your brain and being processed in your central nervous system. Now, your motor nervous system is also divided into two divisions. The first division is the somatic motor division, which is the part that's under voluntary control. So this is your skeletal muscles. Remember when we talked about skeletal muscles, about how these are under voluntary control. Now, this control may be conscious and it may be unconscious. You might not be aware of these things, but it is still voluntary. The autonomic motor division is your involuntary system. This is the system that controls your cardiac muscle, the smooth muscles, all of your glands, your organs. So this is the system that's keeping your heart going, keeping your lungs going, sending saliva to your mouth and creating mucus in your nose, and secreting acid in your stomach after you've had a meal, and making your digestive system contract to digest the food and move that food along through your digestive system. All of that stuff is involuntary. You can't stop it even if you want to. And so that's the involuntary nervous system that handles that part of the signaling. So for those of you who prefer a table, here's a chart of the nervous system divided into sensory and motor, and then each of those divided into two divisions: somatic, sensory, visceral sensory, and then the motor system divided into somatic motor division and autonomic motor division. And remember that all of the sensory information is afferent. It's going to the central nervous system. All of the motor nervous system is efferent. It's coming from the nervous system.